Okay, right now we're sitting down with Kesha Stickland. She's the co-founder and CEO of the Mushroom Meat Company to talk about, among many things, constraint-driven innovation, clean label strategy, and why mushrooms just might be the future of meat alternatives. Kesha, welcome to Protein Production Technology International.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Excellent. Now let's start with your story. What first pulled you into the world of food innovation, and how did that eventually lead to you co-founding the Mushroom Meat Company?
It was absolutely indirect. It was not intentional. So my journey into food innovation really started as journey, a health journey, and transitioning my diet to a plant-based diet. About 10 years ago, I had a major car accident while driving to a client's office. I worked as a consultant to big tech companies, and I had a ton of pain, cortisone shots, muscle relaxants, painkillers. I was just on so many different drugs and nothing seemed to help. They would sort of help temporarily and then they had all these side effects. And then I ended up finding out that I had Hashimoto's disease, which is an autoimmune condition. I really just didn't know what to do next. I was, super active and in my mid 40s, but most people thought I was a lot younger. And I all of a sudden was just, I was sedentary and sick. And so my husband and I eventually found a naturopath. We were referred by a friend who really taught us about the healing power of herbs and whole plant foods and functional mushrooms. And I ended up using mushrooms in a way that I had never expected to. I ate them in my diet before, but basically I ended up using them to reduce inflammation of my injured body parts and help manage my autoimmune flare-ups. And kind of everything moved from there. It was really changing my lifestyle, which led to, solving problems for other people.
So that was your aha moment, I guess, that really lit the fire for you,
Oh no,
rather than a.
the aha moment came so much later. It came when my family, I have awesome kids. I had two teenage boys at home, and my husband. We kind of decided to make this big transition together. And so here I am in my mid 40s. My husband's 50, and we're sitting there going, okay, but we have no idea what to cook for dinner anymore, because meat was the center of plate for us for our whole lives. And it was for our kids. And so it really at first was about, what do I make for dinner? And so I started experimenting with mushrooms. I have always had a culinary bend, and I took cooking classes and I went to chef school like part-time on the side. That was not what I did for a living. And I've always been into fermentation. So when I learned more about mushrooms and that they were, fermented, I started growing mushrooms and just really got into mushroom growing. And the light bulb moment happened when I kind of realized how nutritious mushrooms were, but more than anything, how healing they were. But at the same time, they had these very meat-like properties. Um, but to my kids and my husband, unfortunately, not meat-like enough. They didn't like the textures and flavors and things like that. And I just kind of had this, it was very simple thought, but it turned out to be pretty profound. And it was, what if our mushroom supplement was our meat, or what if our meat was our mushroom supplement? What if they were the same thing and you could barely tell the difference? What if we could not have to feel like we were giving anything up, but we had all these new things to gain? I didn't even know if it was possible at the time, but I wanted to give it a shot.
Yeah. So when did that lifestyle change become you forming a company?
Let's see, lifestyle change happened about 8 years ago. And about halfway through that time period with me experimenting with mushrooms, etc., I actually started working with mycelium first, because, my husband and I had actually stayed on a mushroom farm for a while and learned to work with cultures and work preparing substrates. We were actually setting up a growing process at home in our garage, which basically became our fermentation room. And as we're doing this, I started thinking about some of the specific types of mushroom mycelium that I was working with and how dense I could get the textures to be. And so I actually started working with mushroom mycelium, creating sort of a pork-like alternative. And my husband had this crazy idea. So we were both in software for years. And I had a software startup for a while and applied for funding from the National Science Foundation. He thought, you know what, why don't you apply for funding from the National Science Foundation for your, mushroom-based meat alternative? In this case, it was mycelium-based. So I actually applied, and I wasn't sure if I was going to use fruiting bodies or the mycelium at the time, but I had a prototype that was mycelium-based. So I wrote like a 3-page pitch. And within 3 days, I heard back from the NSF, hey, we think this is interesting. We'd like a full, research proposal.
Wow.
Yep. So
Yes.
that became like an entire year of research that, ended up leading to forming a company.
Uh-huh. You've clearly taken a very intentional approach with both product and brand. How did your previous experience shape the way that you think about impact, especially in a crowded alt protein landscape?
It's kind of funny because it appears to a lot of people like there's no connection. I would say, it was actually two sides. From a personal perspective, it was all about understanding how going much more natural when it came to food. For a while, I even ate almost all raw, and with the exception of the mushrooms don't digest properly raw. But it was about keeping food as natural as possible, whole foods, even being careful about what kinds of fats we consumed and how much, and keeping our diet very low inflammation. And so that part of me and that piece that really believes in that type of eating and what it can do for your health was really driven to not just solve this problem of what it's like to, give up the center of your plate and what it's like to make this transition and not know how to make a meal for yourself or your family or not be able to go to a restaurant and get the kind of food you want to eat. I wanted to be able to solve that for more people, but without having them give up the health benefits that I was already seeing. And on the flip side of that, I spent the last, I don't know, maybe 7 or 8 years of my 25-year career in tech, working as a consultant, teaching customer and data-driven product development, sort of lean thinking, platform thinking, and other types of kind of market white space strategy to Fortune 500 companies. And so for me, when, my husband and literally my husband and kids suggested that I turn this into a business, the first thing that I thought was, I need to know how many other people out there have this same problem and that there's a real market for it. I need to know if there's a gap or a white space in the market that hasn't been filled that I can fill with this. Because I knew that there were companies out there who already had products. I had seen them on the market. I looked at their labels. I tried a few of them, but none of them met my dietary restrictions. And the question was, how many other people were really looking for not just clean, but whole food alternatives that gave them the promise, that fulfilled the promise of a plant-based diet or fulfilled the promise of mushrooms from a health perspective without adding things they didn't want. And so it became about understanding how to turn that into a strategy that filled the gap between a traditional veggie burger and something that people consider to be an ultra-processed food.
We're going to talk about whole foods, superfoods, and ingredients next. But for people discovering you for the first time, how do you describe the Mushroom Meat Company in your own words?
Yeah, the Mushroom Meat Company is a B2B startup. We're focused on food service at the moment, that transforms functional mushrooms and whole plants into beef and pork alternatives. We like to say that we are moving mushrooms from supplements to center stage.
Great. Well, let's talk about ingredients now, Keisha. A lot of the meat alternative space still leans heavily on ultra processed formulations, but you've chosen a completely different path with whole foods, even superfoods. What's behind that decision, apart from your, previously mentioned lifestyle changes?
Well, besides the personal belief in them, it's really understanding that I had this sense when I first dove into like the market and looking at, what was that kind of missing component, what was that white space, that we were always asking people. When I say we, I mean now people, the industry is always asking people to choose. You get to something like meat, and you have, to deal with the fact that the first ingredient is an isolated protein and has a lot of things that, that you might not recognize. But you get that meat-like experience if you, want to give up meat, or you get a veggie burger and you don't get to have your cake and eat it too, as I like to say. Uh, I wasn't happy with that. And I, had this hypothesis that as people looked at, and this was several years ago, so as people looked at what was out there on the market, at first, just this concept of plant-based has a halo around it. Oh, plants healthy. Got it. But when people start to really look at labels and start to really get educated, a lot of times they go, you know what? I'm not sure that I know what this is. I'm not sure that I like this, and so on. And so I had a hypothesis that there would essentially be a backlash coming in a few years as more people were exposed to these products, but also, would start to feel like maybe they were almost misled by just a plant-based label, and assuming that all those things necessarily were healthy.
Mhm.
And totally frank, that's exactly what's happened.
Yeah. Did you think the industry's been a bit too obsessed with mimicking meat at all costs, and in the process may have missed a chance to celebrate simpler, cleaner ingredients?
Absolutely. I I would think that early on, that we didn't have to be just like meat, that we didn't have to look just like meat, that we didn't have to have the exact same texture or flavor. And that it was never our intent to be something that you can't tell the difference of. It was about being able to have the same types of use cases, being able to really kind of easily understand, how do I prepare this and how do I use this? Can I actually create the kind of dishes that I grew up eating, without having to give that up? With still either, deciding I want to give up meat for permanently or part time. Just I could have my health and I could also have, an alternative. And over time, it just got better and better. So I would actually say we are accidentally a meat analog. we were never we were wanting to be something in between a non-analog and a classic analog, but we got so close to the analog side of things that people started to compare us to, kind of the big two here in the US, which was surprising to me. We won a lot of awards based upon that sort of surprise that people had, that they could have something that had, less than 10 whole food ingredients, and it sometimes they couldn't tell it wasn't meat. But again, that was never our intent. The main thing that we made sure of, and that we hold to this day, is we will never sacrifice the integrity of the product, the ingredient list, the nutrition, etc., just to make it more like meat.
Yeah. What makes mushrooms such a powerful base for meat alternatives?
A few things. The first thing is really simple. I mean, there's a reason that they've just kind of generally been used as an alternative to meat by a lot of people for, so many years and so many cultures. It's because they have a natural meatiness in texture. They are very high in umami or savory compounds, just like, meat is. Their texture and flavor is a little bit different, but they also offer really unique health benefits. So they are extremely high in protein. We add additional protein, but they have complete protein, right? Which is unusual for any sort of non-meat food. Many fungi have complete protein. And the other things about it, which are really special, are almost every mushroom, especially fruiting body, has anti-inflammatory compounds. Most of them have cancer-fighting compounds. They have almost zero fat unless you add fat to them. They are high in fiber. They can most contain vitamin D, many contain B12. So the nutrition is off the charts. And so from our perspective, all we had to do was frankly not screw that up.
You previously mentioned clean label. Are you finding that consumers are actually asking for shorter labels, ingredients that they can recognize, or is there still some education needed to help shift perceptions?
I don't think there's education needed to shift perceptions at all. I think the perceptions are actually strongly in favor of not just clean labels, but things that people look at and they recognize. So familiarity or, real food, that kind of thing. And I think, to be honest with you, I think some of it's a bit unfair. I mean, if you look at the ingredients in a lot of meat, if you understand how meat is processed, I've studied the way meat is processed. It's not a very clean food.
Mm.
And yet people don't really read the labels of the meat they eat, even the processed meat, and they sort of give it a pass. But when something has to be a catalyst for change, it gets scrutinized in a different way, in an often unfair way. And that might be true, but that's also why we've been so diligent about keeping our label as clean and simple and familiar as possible, because we wanted to be above that scrutiny.
Mhm. We're going to change subjects now. There's a saying that creativity loves constraints, and it sounds like that's definitely been true in your journey. Are you able to share an example where a challenge or limitation actually sparked an unexpected innovation?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in general, we use a methodology called constraint-driven product development. It's part of a methodology that I used to teach customers, funny enough, in the software space. But it really involves, intentionally creating a set of constraints. For us, that's ingredients we won't use, types of processing we won't do, things like that. But then what we do is we focus on a functional need, some problem we have to solve. And when you have to solve that problem in the face of those constraints that you've defined, you have to be creative and you have to come up with wholly new solutions for solving them. So one of them, that we'll talk about probably a little bit more in a bit, um, is texture, right? If I want to have a texture that makes people feel more like they're getting that dense chew of meat that they want, etc., how do I do that when I don't have texturizing gums and methylcellulose and things like that as my option, right? That's probably the best example. But we've done the same thing with flavor. We don't use natural flavors, for example, or any flavors from a flavor house. So when you have those challenges, you have to solve them in ways that are completely different from anybody else. But what that does is it brings all these new types of ingredients and new types of thinking and new types of methods of processing to the table.
Mhm. How has that limited funding pushed you to think differently, whether it's in R&D or how you go to market?
Wow. And in every possible way. Everything from, okay, I need a piece of equipment, and then I'll ask the team, like, I think we want to try this, where are we going to get it? So, it's, going and finding out where you can get used equipment, whether it's lab equipment or just general food processing equipment, understanding that, hey, I'm using this method of processing, and nobody's ever done it before with this type of ingredient, but maybe it's similar to something in another area of food production, right? So now what we try to do is make sure that we don't use any custom hardware, any custom, processing tools. We basically say, okay, well, you know what? People have been processing meat forever. Let's figure out how much we can use from meat, how much we can use from other areas of, fermentation, etc., so that we can, not only keep our costs low, but also get things secondhand if we need to.
Mhm. Some founders say that constraints give them clarity. Do you feel that working within limits has actually helped sharpen your focus?
Absolutely. Because we essentially, it forces you to solve one major problem at a time. When you have no constraints, a lot of times, it becomes difficult to figure out, well, what do I do next? And you don't have the same level of focus. But when you have the ability to say, okay, I have to solve this major problem and I solve this one problem right now, and that's my priority, and I can't do it these ways. So now I need to build a list systematically of potential solutions that I work through. It focuses you.
Mhm. And when you're operating with a lean team and tight deadlines, how do you keep that spirit of innovation alive?
Honestly, it's very different from the way that you keep innovation alive in a big company. I spent lots of times in big companies. When you have the small, what we kind of call a tiger team, we operate very similar to the way that I feel like small software teams operate. We call it kind of a scrum team, where we have a daily check-in. There's constant communication, and there's always crazy deadlines because we always have some demand and some push, and we all do 5 jobs. And so what it what it what's important more than anything else is believing in the why and feeling like we're doing something that matters, that we're bringing the world something that it needs, and that drives us as we continuously solve these problems and frankly push ourselves to the limit. It's ultimately about belief in the why, and I feel like if you don't have a team that's aligned around mission, right, you don't know what you're innovating for.
Mhm. We're going to come on to the Mushroom Meat Platform now. You've described your approach as almost software inspired, with a modular system that acts like Lego blocks for building different meat alternatives. So where did that mindset come from, Kesha?
It came from many, many years in software, understanding what the best way to build a product is and what the worst way to build a product is. And I've always, for a very long time, thought that this kind of one-off approach, especially if you want to create multiple products over time, where every single one is, newly built from the ground up, that has the separate ingredients, separate production process, separate everything. That's time consuming. It's costly. It's wasteful. So one of the things that I used to teach my clients was this concept of a platform. You can have platform business models. So the business side of platforms. You can also have technology platforms, right? That might be a production method. That might be based on the way something is composed. And what you normally find people talking about and using when they say platforms in food is they're usually talking about, the machinery potentially that they use to process their products. We use very off-the-shelf machinery. And so what we talk about our platform, we're actually not talking about the machinery. What we're talking about is the ingredients that we used to make products. We basically think of them like components. That's when you can think of a Lego block, right? You can build many, many different things from a Lego block. For us, we know that there's certain problems that you solve when you're creating an alternative to meat over and over and over. It's got to have a base with a certain type of texture, right? It's got to have mouthfeel and sometimes fattiness. It's got to have, flavor that is kind of strong and savoriness and so on. And so this, I don't think, was the original intent from the beginning, this kind of going down this platform approach and creating this sort of component model for creating products. But it's what happened just because it's the way that I think, it's the way that my team thinks, it's our background, and it's sort of in our blood.
Mhm. Looking at how that works in practice, how does that modular platform help you spin out different product types, whether that be, burgers or other formats?
Well, the first thing is that um, mushrooms are the base for everything, and mushrooms are the primary flavorant in everything. That kind of makes it easy. But we have we call our base TMP, which is sort of nicknamed that because it's a mushroom alternative to texturized vegetable protein. And that's because our process allows us to use mushrooms in the same way that you might use TVP, meaning that it provides the primary foundation for our texture. But it also, our TMP can be shaped and flavored like pretty much any kind of meat. It can be stained, say, with beet juice and so on. So you can get something that's more like pork or more like beef from it. You can create it in multiple shapes, chop it, grind it, shred it, and so on. And so what that allows us to do is take the same basic process and the same base and create many different products. If you notice, you'll see a lot of companies that are very well funded. They have one product for a very long period of time, where we are not very well funded and created multiple products in a fairly short period of time. And that's just because of that type of thinking. We have a base, we have a flavor enhancer that we call umami booster, that is the base of all of the flavors that we create, and a general methodology for creating those flavors. And we have in process a fat replacer that is essentially can be sort of modulated to be more like a beef fat that melts and more like a pork fat that doesn't melt, but it's made with mushrooms and avocado oil. And so these things are things that we can reuse very quickly to create multiple different types of products.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, it's a big shift from the usual single product startup model that we see elsewhere. I mean, how has that platform first strategy helped you stay both agile and scalable?
Well, I mean, I think the first thing is, it makes creating a new product very easy. For one, if you have for example, a flavor that is a beef style flavor, and you have a base that can be in multiple shapes, you can have shredded beef, you can have chunks of beef, and very quickly you can have a burger. And so that makes product development much faster, much more kind of lean and agile. It means you spend a lot less money and a lot less time on R&D. It also means you don't have to buy a bunch of new equipment every time you create a new product. And so you have lower scaling costs, you have lower production costs, and so on. And so that's been our model, and it will continue to be the model, because every time, for example, we go, okay, we want a burger, but a burger is a ground product. Well, that means it could be now ground pork. It could be sausage. It could be, sausage patties. It could be a bunch of different things, because once we solve those problems, we always solve them in a repeatable way, which allows us to be able to create multiple products from one sort of new direction.
Hmm. Now, the word disruptive gets thrown a lot about in this space. I'm guilty of it myself, but you seem to be backing it up with action. So, what does true disruption mean to you when it comes to alternative proteins?
It's kind of interesting, because I think in almost pretty much any field, disruption really is about solving a problem in a fundamentally new way, in a way that essentially transforms the industry. And I actually believe that we are doing that, and I believe that we have been for some time. I feel like what happens when people think, you know what, it's not possible to create something that is an alternative to meat that is just as delicious, that's just as satisfying, with whole foods and with, very simple, clean label, and you go and do it. And you win awards and you gain, recognition for that. I think it also, it raises the bar, and it forces other people to step back and go, why can't I do something like that too? Find their own ways of doing that. And as you look at what, I think the industry is struggling with, which is this sort of reputation for ultra processed foods, the more that we put products out there like that, that give people the satisfaction that they're looking for, but at the same time, mean in a way that they don't have to say, you know what, I have to give up the ingredients that I want, or I have to give up the taste and texture in order to have the ingredients, and so on. It ends up forcing, I think, a change to the entire industry, because once one party does it, you change the expectation of the consumer.
Hmm. What are the bigger industry-wide issues that you think the mushroom meat is well positioned to address?
There are several. I think that we're struggling because of some of the reputation of the industry. I think there was a sort of an overzealousness in terms of how much money companies raised for quite a while, and then at the same time, over promising and under delivering. And I think at the same time, this sort of super duper focused, like you mentioned, on the likeness to meat at all costs, that then caused, that made the industry vulnerable to critics, and really allowed people to really start spreading, just a general consensus, a general idea that everything was ultra processed, and that that the industry was all waste and not real, and so on and so forth. And I feel like that sort of those instances have hurt all of us. Even though, you look at us and you go, wait a minute, these guys are somebody who started a business, in their home kitchen and garage, and we only raised like $1 million, and we have a tiny team, and we do a lot with that tiny team. We're still in an industry that has now an image problem. And I think it's important for all of us to figure out that are still here. How do we change that? And how do we take the industry into what I think is the next level and the next phase of creating alternatives to meat, whether those are analogs or non-analogs. We need to be more frugal. We need to have business models that make sense. We need to have economic models that make sense. We need to have margins that work, and so on. And I think for us, that's always been our foundation. We were never the super deep tech startup that was going to make an investor a ton of money from many, many different markups. We just have a business that makes sense, and we need more businesses that make sense.
Yeah. I was just wondering, do you see your platform as something that could eventually be licensed, or is the disruption more about rethinking the end product itself?
I think there's a ridiculous number of possibilities. There always has been. Originally, we thought about going down sort of an ingredient path, but felt that the challenge with that was that initially, nobody thought we could do what we were doing. Nobody thought it was possible. They didn't think that our products had the taste and texture that they did once they saw the label. And so we had to create end products just to get anybody to pay attention, to get any customers excited, and so on and so forth. And so once we did that, we found that the idea of going ingredient was challenging for a couple of reasons. The first is that it can cannibalize your end product market, in our case, food service, because now you're competing with your own customers. And then the second problem with it is that, ingredient business requires way more scale even than food service, and much more funding, et cetera. And so the way that we look at that type of model now at this point is very opportunistic, right? If the right partner comes along and says, hey, for example, I would like to be able to use this, either your base ingredients or even, the end products in a specific region with some level of exclusivity, but I've got something to offer back to you, like, maybe guaranteed volumes, help with scaling or investment and so on. We are actually having a couple of those conversations, and we're open to them. Our goal is to bring this to the world, and if that means we're bringing it directly, we'll do it. If that means we're bringing it as a part of another company that has acquired us, we're okay with doing that. If it means that we do it with partners that are corporates, we're open to doing that. We're just keeping our options open. We believe that not only are products like this needed by the market, but that this type of approach is something that could fundamentally help transform the industry. And we don't think it needs to be, just a Mushroom Meat Co branded product.
Hmm. You're operating in a world of well-funded giants. What's it like being a bootstrap startup going up against that scale?
It's crazy. We're not fully bootstrapped anymore. We have one VC investment and angels, but it's a super duper David and Goliath type situation, right? When we go into clients, especially lately, our clients are comparing us to guys that have had, 20 million, 100 million, 500 million, billions in funding. And we haven't actually lost a sale yet. So, our biggest challenge is scaling to meet the demand. What I try to do is remember that we started down this path because there was a gap and there was a white space in the market that I think still exists. And does that mean that everybody's going to, appreciate our differentiators? No, but it means that there's enough that we will have a business. And so it's, incumbent on us to just keep marching forward and not worry about what everybody else has and what we have or don't have, as long as we have enough. To be honest, a lot of the companies that we were so worried about from a competition perspective are not even around anymore. And they've had 10 to 100 times the investment that we have, and even more. So like I said, the way I look at it is there's enough, if you're doing it right, there's enough room in the space for all of us.
Hmm. Do you think that financial situation that you found yourself in, it's helped you stay closer to your mission, or at least avoid some of the pressures that come with outside capital?
Oh, completely. I mean, I talked to, you know, other founders, especially other female founders, who talk about how challenging it is, especially if you have a more sort of clean label centric, and very mission oriented business. Um, I believe, that we produce products pretty quickly, but we also have this demand from several big customers, to come out with a burger. But they also want it to be meeting the same type of, guidelines as our current products. Well, that's very difficult, and it's taken a while, right? I feel like if we had, the classic, you know, heavily VC funded scenario, we would have been pressured to make, concessions that actually tarnish our brand. And I've actually heard of a lot of other people having to do that because they have these either time to market pressures or this pressure to get a deal, and they sub optimize what the company is all about. We haven't had to do that, which I believe is fantastic. I don't know that we'll be able to get away with that forever, but we're going to as long as we can.
Hmm. What are some of the scrappier, more creative tactics that you've had to rely on? Things a bigger player might not even consider.
Oh, geez, there's so many. An obvious one is we had to figure out how do we move out of R&D in our home to, an actual facility space where we could produce something where we could actually really just even start to sample and all this other kind of stuff. And so we ended up in a shared kitchen. This is back when we were in North Carolina. That did not make sense for us in any way, shape, or form. We had like specialized equipment that we had to move in and out of it, like physically rolling things on rollers. It was crazy. We had to rent time and space in the kitchen, which again made no sense when you have a fermentation process. And we're like, okay, so they're like, hey, why are you renting around the clock for like, days and things like that? It didn't make sense, but it was all we had, to work with at the time. And then as we decided we were going to scale up, we were like, okay, well, we don't have the funding to build our own, facility space, but we have a unique process that we can't just take to a co-man. So we went to, kind of that next level up, which, and here in California, there are multiple different types of sort of next level from shared kitchens. They're essentially shared facility spaces for food production. And every other food producer was like, hey, we make, meals for people, or we're a caterer, or, we make, chocolate bars. And here we are making a fermented protein, in the same sort of facility space, but it didn't matter because we had a big room that we could move our custom equipment into that was, certified by the health department already and so on. And it was affordable. And funny enough, we found out that, one of the spaces that we used, both Beyond and Impossible had used it at one point for a while. And so we were like, you know what? If those guys could get started in these kind of spaces, then so can we. And we just, took it and went from there.
Definitely. I mean, looking ahead, Keisha, what's the next big milestone on your radar? Are you focused on scaling production, or maybe expanding into new markets or partnerships?
Honestly, all of the above. So our immediate focus is on scaling up. We have a very sort of pragmatic way that we do that. Our investors and the new investors that we are working with are all about, you know, sales, right? Where it is ultimately, okay, show us the purchase orders, we scale up to meet the demand. And so it's a continuous sell, scale up, sell, scale up kind of a process, which for a lot of people might seem kind of slow and painful, but it's actually very pragmatic. And we're finding that it works for us. We take the amount of money that we need, in order to produce what we need to produce in order to make revenue. That's the kind of model. At the same time, we are in conversation with, one corporate right now, about the possibilities of using our end products and even the possibility of using some of our ingredients. And we keep those options open. At the same time, we've also had a couple of acquisition conversations. Those didn't go in the direction we wanted them to go. But like I said, we keep our options open. At the end of the day, we're about making the change that we intend to make, however it is that needs to happen. And to be frank, this is my second career, and I don't necessarily think that that I want to be doing it 20 years from now. I just want to make the impact. And whether that's 2 more years or 5 more years, who knows? At the end of the day, we're just going to do what we need to do to bring, our products to the world and to show people that, mushrooms are a real option for center of the plate food. And you don't have to give anything up to get what you're looking for from a health perspective.
Well, you answered one of my questions there about any big players. Have they come knocking yet?
Some very big players, some of the biggest players have come knocking, which is the craziest thing ever. And I mean, that part of that happened because we were in Mass Challenge a couple of years ago. And so we had some unusual introductions for a company of our size. And they haven't, I think, led to anything that's on the market at this point. It's mostly just tests and in conversations. But some of those are still ongoing. And like I said, we're open to them. And we'll take it from there.
Mm-hmm. Zooming out a bit, what's your long-term vision, Kesha? Do you see the Mushroom Meat Company as a standalone brand, a broader platform, or something else entirely?
So that it is a broader platform. That's true no matter what. And I believe that there's, a pull in the market. And I believe the market is pulling these types of products, pulling, food that actually has, healing potential. I think there's a lot of potential from a food as medicine perspective, from a gut health perspective, from hey, I can actually have something that is essentially a health supplement that I can also use as a center plate item. I don't think that there's a lot out there that can do that. And I think that because of that, and because of those trends, no matter what happens with us as an individual brand, I think that the approach that we've taken and the way that we've shown what's possible is going to result in a change in the industry. And if that becomes something that becomes part of a bunch of different companies and their products, I'm good with that being our contribution.
Mm-hmm. We're going to wrap up soon, but if you could leave our readers and listeners with one big idea about the future of meat alternatives, what would that be?
It would be that what they look like in the future doesn't have to be what they've looked like in the past. And it's probably more of a message to all of the product developers out there, all of the food scientists out there, et cetera, that believe that their base needs to be, always a protein isolate, that they need to use certain ingredients to meet functional requirements. It's okay to do something completely different from what everybody else in the industry has done in one way or in every way. Because at the end of the day, if we all do the same thing, nothing ever changes. And I don't think this industry can afford to have no change. And so I really feel like as long as we understand and can really identify with what consumers are looking for, rather than just what we want to make for them, then we'll be down the right path. It's ultimately about letting the market pull from you what it wants instead of you telling the market what you want them to have.
Mm-hmm. That leads me on to my next question, actually. Is there something you think consumers are going to start demanding that the industry hasn't fully delivered on yet?
Yes. And it's something that we feel that we has always been core to us. And it is what I was talking about. It is real health benefits, not a clean label, but a reason to transition away from meat, either part-time or full-time. If you look at most of the reasons that people give, they'll talk about taste, they'll talk about convenience. Those are all based upon the premise that somebody has a reason. If you're looking at, hey, animals, we shouldn't slaughter them, and animal welfare could be that reason. Or if you're looking at, sustainability and we really want to save the planet, unfortunately, that's not the primary driver for most people, especially not in the US, but I'm finding not in other areas of the world either. The biggest driver is health. And if I'm thinking that I want to reduce meat consumption, which is why we focused on things that were similar to beef and pork at first, for example, because those are the main types of meat that people cut back on, then you need to be able to give them a benefit that they're looking for. In our case, we say, okay, mushrooms boost gut health. Mushrooms boost the immune system. Mushrooms provide, anti-inflammatory benefits. They provide cancer protection. These are reasons to do something that are not about what's not in our product. It's about what is in our product. So the industry has to start thinking about, how do we entice consumers to make a behavior change by giving them a benefit even before they taste it. Of course, it has to taste good, but people are making these decisions with their mind before they know what it tastes like. And the more we focus on giving people a benefit that drives them to make behavior change, the more we will be in a better place.
And finally, for anyone eager to follow your journey or try your products for themselves, what's the best way for them to stay in the loop?
The best way is to just follow us on social, on Instagram or on LinkedIn. We're at Mushroom Meat Co. Also online at mushroommeatco.com. And sign up for our newsletter, where we'll be talking about, where we're launching. We're focused on food service, so we're starting in universities, but we actually do have a restaurant deal that's coming up, and we'll be talking about that pretty soon. And there's about 17 locations that we'll roll out across incrementally. And so just we'll keep everybody up to date if you listen on those channels.
Cool. Well, hopefully you share that news with us first, Kesha. But thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights. It's been fascinating to hear how you're building something both deeply principled and genuinely innovative. So we'll be following the Mushroom Meat Company's journey closely, and we can't wait to see what comes next.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you, Kesha. Take care.